Let's talk about loading bugs. This is both the most challenging and important exercise I've designed for you. So pay lots of attention to this lesson because you're going to have a lot of aha moments. So here are the behaviors we need to test. I've organized these behaviors into this hierarchy. So when loading bugs, if they exist in the cache, they should come from the cache. If they don't exist in the cache, then they should be fetched from the server. And our loading indicator should be true while fetching the bugs. It should be false after the bugs are fetched or if the server fails. This is one way to organize these behaviors. It's not the only or the best way. It's just one way I could think of before recording this video. You may organize these behaviors however you want. It doesn't really matter. So let's start testing these behaviors one by one. So in our test file, here's our parent group. I'm going to create a new group here. So describe loading bugs. So I'm creating these groups based on how I've organized these behaviors, okay? So we have loading bugs. Inside this group, we have another group if the bugs exist in the cache. So let's add that over here. Describe if the bugs exist in the cache. Now we need another group next to this one if the bugs don't exist in the cache, okay? And inside this group, we should have another group for our loading indicator. So describe loading indicator. Now here we need three tests. Let's have a quick look. Our loading indicator should be true while fetching bugs. So let's implement this test. It should be true while fetching the bugs. Now in this test, we should dispatch the load bugs action. So let's import it on the top. Load bugs. Now back to our test. So first we need to program our fake axis object. Fake axis dot. If you have a GET request to this endpoint, the server should respond with the status code of 200 and it should give us an array of bug objects. We can add a single bug object in this array. That's enough. Then we need to act. So store the dispatch, load bugs. Now, what about our assertion? In this case, we don't want to wait for this call to finish in order to expect something. We want to check to see if the loading indicator is true while fetching the bugs. So let me show you a trick. If you look at the documentation of this mock access adapter, you can see that the reply method has two signatures. One way to call it is to pass two arguments, the status code and the object that should go in the body of the response. Another way is to pass a function here. Now, in this function, we should return an array with two items. These items are going to be these two arguments. So copy, paste them over here. So these two ways of calling the reply method are identical. Now, the benefit of passing a function here is that inside this function, we can execute some code before the server responds. So this is where we can check the loading property. So bug slice that loading should be true while we're waiting for the server to respond, okay? Now let's remove the expect here. In this case, I don't want to await this because we don't want to wait for this to complete to make an assertion, okay? Now, let's remove this line over here. Good. And then run our tests. All right, our test is passing. Beautiful. So let's write the second test. The loading indicator should be false after the bugs are fetched. So I'm going to duplicate this test to save some time. Now let's change the label to should be false after the bugs are fetched. Now, in this test, we're not going to use this function syntax. So we just want to return a response with a status code of 200. And here we pass an array of one bug object, okay? Now, in this test, we should await this call because we have to wait for this to finish to check the loading indicator. Now, we should mark this test as async. And then we expect that bug slice dot loading to be false, like this. Let's run our tests. All right, we have a failing test, and it's saying that we expected false, but we got true. This is a bit tricky, and it's because of a bug in our code. Let me explain. So let's not worry about awaiting this for a second. And I'm going to remove the async as well. Let's see what the dispatch method returns. So I'm going to log it on the console. Debug X. Take a look. So we got undefined. What's going on here? Well, by default, when we dispatch an action, a regular action, like a plain object with a type property, this method returns the action that was dispatched. So it returns this object over here. Now, in this case, we're calling the loadBugs action creator. So let's take a quick look at the implementation of this function. So here's our action creator. This action creator is a thunk. It's a function that returns another function. It doesn't return a plain action object, right? Now in this function, we're dispatching the action object that is returned by API call began. So this function returns a plain action object, and we pass that to the dispatch function, right? Now the problem we have here is that we are not returning the object that is returned from the dispatch function. That is the reason why we got undefined in our test. So if we return this, look what happens. So in our test file, let's log X one more time. Take a look. Now we got a promise. This is the promise that we needed to await. So let's await this call and mark this function as async. This is going to solve our problem. So run again. All tests passing. Beautiful. Now the third test for the loading indicator. If the server responds with an error, the loading indicator should be false again. So to save time, I'm going to duplicate this. So the loading indicator should be false if the server returns an error. Here we should reply with a status code of 500 and then check to see if the loading indicator is false. Pretty straightforward. So run again. Beautiful. So we have implemented all the tests for our loading indicator. Now let's write a test for this scenario. If the bugs exist in the cache, then they should come from the cache. So we should not call the server for the second time. This is a very valuable test to write. So in our test file, here's our group. If the bugs exist in the cache, then they should come from the cache, or we can reword it as they should not be fetched from the server again. That's another way. In this test, just like before, we should program our fake access object. So if we get a request on this endpoint, we should get a response with this code, and in the body of the response, we're going to have an array of one bug object. Now, to test this behavior, I'm going to dispatch the loadBugs action twice and then check to see if we have had a single HTTP request to the backend. This is the proper way to test this behavior. So in our bug slice, we have this reducer, bugs received, and here we're setting the last fetch property to the current date time. Now in our test, we don't touch this property because this is implementation detail. The implementation can change in the future. Tomorrow, we may rename this property, or instead of storing the current date time here, we might store an object. So the implementation may change, but the fact that we're going to call the server only once will not change. So the proper way to test this behavior is to dispatch the loadBugs action twice and then check to see if we have had a single HTTP request to the backend. So here we're going to dispatch the loadBugs action and then await this call. Let's make our test async. Now, we're going to duplicate this line and then check to see if we have had a single HTTP request to the backend. How? Well, if you look at the documentation of Access Mock Adapter, you will see that this object has a property called history. We can get the history of get requests. This returns an array. So we can check to see if the length of this array equals 1. As simple as that. This is the proper way to test this behavior. Let's run our tests. All tests passing. Beautiful. Now, the last test we need to write is for this scenario. If the bugs don't exist in the cache, we should fetch them from the server. So here's our group. If the bugs don't exist in the cache, in this group, I'm going to add a test. They should be fetched from the server. We can be more explicit here and say, and put in the store. That's better. Now, just like before, we need to mock our HTTP call. So I'm going to borrow this code from the other test and paste it here. Now we're going to call store.dispatch loadBugs. Then we need to await it because we have to wait for this to finish in order for us to check the state of the store. So let's make the test async and then expect bug slice .list to have length because the server responds with a single bug object. Now let's run our test again. All tests passing. Beautiful. With this, let's get another coverage report. Look, our store is getting better test coverage. Previously, we were at 50%. Now we are at 78%. Let's take a closer look. So here's the bug slice. We have tested pretty much everything in this module except assigning a bug to a user. So I leave it up to you as an additional exercise.